The champagne glasses hit the marble floor with a shattering crash that echoed through the stunned silence of 300 wedding guests. Rebecca stood at the altar in her $1,000 dress, her trembling finger still pointing at the massive screen that had just finished playing a 5-minute video that would destroy everything her groom thought he knew about his perfect day. The footage wasn't just evidence of betrayal. It was evidence of a crime that went far deeper than anyone in that lavish ballroom could have ever imagined. What happened next would leave every single person in that room questioning everything they thought they knew about the woman they had come to celebrate, and the man she had just publicly destroyed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Rebecca Martinez had always been the type of woman who planned everything down to the smallest detail. At 28, she had built a successful marketing consultancy from nothing, owned her own home in downtown Charleston, and had never once in her adult life made a decision without carefully considering every possible outcome. So when she agreed to marry Michael Thompson after 18 months of what everyone called a whirlwind romance, her friends and family assumed she had done her usual meticulous research into the man who had swept her off her feet with his charm, his family's real estate empire, and his seemingly genuine devotion to making her the center of his universe. What they didn't know was that Rebecca had indeed done her research. She had done more research than any bride in the history of marriage had ever done on her future husband. And what she had discovered in the 3 weeks leading up to their wedding day would have sent most women running for the hills, canceling everything, and never looking back. Michael Thompson was everything Rebecca had thought she wanted in a husband when they first met at a charity gala in downtown Charleston. He was 6'2" with the kind of confident smile that made restaurant servers remember his name and real estate clients sign contracts before they had even seen the second bedroom. His family owned Thompson Properties, one of the most successful real estate development companies in the Southeast, and Michael had been groomed since childhood to eventually take over the business his grandfather had started in 1952. He drove a BMW, lived in a penthouse apartment overlooking the harbor, and had the kind of old-money Southern charm that made Rebecca's middle-class parents feel like they had won the lottery when he started showing up to family dinners every Sunday. He remembered her mother's birthday, brought her father Cuban cigars, and talked about their future children with a kind of genuine excitement that made Rebecca start looking at wedding venues before he had even officially proposed. The proposal itself had been everything Rebecca had ever dreamed of and several things she hadn't even known she wanted. Michael had rented out the entire top floor of the historic Rainbow Row mansion where they had their first date, filled it with white roses and string lights, and had hired a violinist to play their song while he got down on one knee with a 3-carat diamond ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Rebecca said yes before he had even finished asking the question, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. She loved Michael Thompson with the kind of desperate, all-consuming love that makes otherwise intelligent women ignore red flags and rationalize away behaviors that would have sent them running if they had witnessed them in someone else's relationship. She loved the way he made her coffee every morning before she woke up, the way he called her mother just to check in, and the way he looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world even when she was wearing sweatpants and had sauce on her shirt from cooking dinner. The wedding planning process had been a dream come true for someone like Rebecca, who thrived on organization and attention to detail. They had booked the Magnolia Plantation for the ceremony and reception, hired the best caterer in Charleston, and sent out invitations to 300 of their closest friends and family members. Rebecca's dress was a custom creation that had taken 4 months to make, and Michael's tuxedo was hand-tailored by the same company that had dressed his father and grandfather on their wedding days. Every single detail had been planned and executed with a kind of precision that would have made military generals proud, and Rebecca had never been happier or more excited about anything in her entire life. She was marrying the man of her dreams in front of everyone who mattered to them, and she was going to do it in style that would be remembered and talked about for decades to come. 3 weeks before the wedding, Rebecca was working late in her home office when her laptop chimed with an email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read, "You need to see this before Saturday," and Rebecca almost deleted it as spam before something made her hesitate and click it open instead. The email contained no text, just a single video file and a phone number with a message that said, "Call me after you watch this. You deserve to know the truth." Rebecca's first instinct was to delete the entire thing without watching whatever was on that video, but curiosity got the better of her and she clicked play. What she saw on that screen made her stomach drop to the floor and her hands start shaking so violently that she could barely move the mouse to pause the footage. The video showed Michael in what was clearly the bedroom of his penthouse apartment, but he wasn't alone. He was with a woman Rebecca recognized immediately as Sarah Chen, the new junior partner at his father's real estate firm who had started working there 6 months ago. But this wasn't just evidence of an affair. This was evidence of something much worse, much more calculated, and much more devastating than Rebecca could have ever imagined. In the video, Michael and Sarah weren't just having sex. They were going through documents spread across his bed, documents that Rebecca recognized as confidential client files from Thompson Properties. Sarah was photographing each page with her phone while Michael explained how they could use the information to buy properties before his family's company put in official offers, essentially stealing deals worth millions of dollars from his own father's business. Rebecca watched the entire 23-minute video 3 times before she called the phone number that had been included in the email. The voice that answered was female, professional, and belonged to someone who identified herself as Detective Amanda Rodriguez with the Charleston County Sheriff's Office. Detective Rodriguez explained that Sarah Chen was not who she claimed to be, that her real name was Sarah Kim and she was a federal informant working with the FBI to investigate Thompson Properties for money laundering and tax evasion. Michael had unknowingly fallen into a trap that had been set months ago, and his affair with Sarah was being used to gather evidence that would eventually bring down not just Michael, but his entire family's business empire. The FBI had been investigating Thompson Properties for 3 years, and Sarah's relationship with Michael was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Detective Rodriguez told Rebecca that the FBI had planned to arrest Michael 2 days after the wedding, but they wanted to give her the opportunity to know the truth before she legally tied herself to a man who was about to face federal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. Rebecca sat in her home office until sunrise, staring at her phone and trying to process what she had just learned. The man she was supposed to marry in 3 weeks wasn't just cheating on her with a colleague. He was unwittingly helping a federal informant build a case that would destroy his family and send him to prison for potentially decades. Every romantic dinner, every sweet gesture, every moment of their entire relationship had been happening while Michael was living a double life that he didn't even know was being recorded and documented by federal investigators. Rebecca's first instinct was to call Michael immediately and confront him about everything she had seen and learned. Her second instinct was to call off the wedding, return the dress, cancel the venue, and disappear before anyone could ask her questions she wasn't prepared to answer. But as she sat there in her office chair, watching the sunrise paint her walls golden yellow, a third option began to form in her mind. An option that was dangerous, possibly illegal, and definitely the kind of thing that would change her life forever. Rebecca Martinez had always been the type of woman who planned everything down to the smallest detail, and she was about to plan the most elaborate act of public justice that Charleston society had ever witnessed. Over the next 3 weeks, Rebecca became an actress worthy of an Academy Award. She continued planning the wedding with the same enthusiasm and attention to detail that had characterized the entire process, all while secretly working with Detective Rodriguez and the FBI to coordinate what they were calling Operation Wedding Day. The federal agents needed more evidence to guarantee convictions, and Rebecca was going to give them the opportunity to get it while simultaneously getting her own justice in front of 300 witnesses who had spent months celebrating a relationship built on lies and criminal activity. She smiled when Michael talked about their honeymoon, nodded when he discussed their future children, and never once let him see the fury that was building inside her chest like a fire that threatened to consume everything in its path. Rebecca's maid of honor was her sister Jessica, who noticed immediately that something had changed about Rebecca in those final weeks before the wedding. Jessica had always been the more intuitive of the 2 Martinez sisters, and she could sense that Rebecca was carrying a secret that was eating her alive from the inside out. When Jessica finally confronted her sister about what was wrong, Rebecca broke down and told her everything. Jessica's first reaction was shock, her second was fury, and her third was absolute admiration for the plan that Rebecca had put together with the help of federal law enforcement. Jessica agreed to help without hesitation, and she became the only person other than Rebecca who knew what was really going to happen when those 300 guests gathered at Magnolia Plantation to witness what they thought was going to be the most beautiful wedding of the year. Michael spent those 3 weeks completely oblivious to the storm that was gathering around him. He continued his affair with Sarah, continued passing confidential information to her without realizing he was building the case that would destroy his life, and continued planning for a future with Rebecca that was never going to exist. He picked out the music for their first dance, wrote vows that talked about honesty and trust and building a life together based on truth and mutual respect. He called Rebecca every night to say goodnight, sent her flowers at work just because it was Tuesday, and talked to his parents about how excited he was to finally have found the woman he was going to spend the rest of his life with. Michael Thompson was living in a fantasy world that was about to be shattered in the most public and humiliating way possible. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear with the kind of perfect weather that wedding planners dream about and brides take as a sign that everything is going to go exactly according to plan. Rebecca woke up in her childhood bedroom at her parents' house, surrounded by her bridesmaids who had stayed over to help her get ready for what they all believed was going to be the happiest day of her life. Rebecca smiled and laughed and let her friends do her hair and makeup while her mother cried happy tears and her father paced nervously in the living room, practicing the speech he was going to give at the reception. Nobody suspected that Rebecca had barely slept in 3 weeks, that she had memorized every word she was going to say when the moment came, and that she had spent hours practicing in front of her bedroom mirror to make sure her voice wouldn't shake when she revealed the truth about the man they had all come to love and accept as part of their family. At Magnolia Plantation, Michael was getting ready in the groom's suite with his best man Marcus and his father Richard, who was beaming with pride about his son's choice in a wife and talking about how much he was looking forward to having Rebecca as a daughter-in-law. Michael's hands were steady as he adjusted his tie and checked his appearance in the mirror one final time. He had no idea that federal agents were already positioned throughout the venue, disguised as wedding guests, photographers, and catering staff. He had no idea that every word he spoke was being recorded, that every move he made was being watched, and that the woman he was about to marry had spent 3 weeks planning his public destruction with the same meticulous attention to detail that she had used to plan their entire relationship. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and by 3:45 every single seat was filled with friends and family members who had traveled from across the country to witness what they believed was going to be a celebration of true love conquering all. Rebecca's wedding dress was even more beautiful than it had looked in the bridal shop, and she walked down the aisle to Pachelbel's Canon in D with tears in her eyes that everyone assumed were tears of joy. Michael stood at the altar watching the love of his life approach him, and the smile on his face was so genuine and full of happiness that several guests later said it was the most beautiful thing they had ever seen at a wedding. What they didn't know was that those tears in Rebecca's eyes were tears of grief for the life she had thought she was going to have, and that Michael's happiness was about to be replaced by the kind of shock and humiliation that would follow him for the rest of his life. The ceremony proceeded exactly according to the traditional script until the moment when the officiant asked if anyone had any reason why these two should not be lawfully wed. In most weddings, this question is followed by silence and then the continuation of the vows, but at Rebecca and Michael's wedding, Rebecca herself raised her hand and said in a voice that carried clearly across the entire venue, "Actually, I do." The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear the sound of Spanish moss rustling in the ancient oak trees that surrounded the plantation. Michael's face went from confusion to concern to the beginning of panic as Rebecca turned to face the 300 guests who were staring at her in stunned silence. Rebecca reached into her bouquet and pulled out a small remote control that she had hidden among the white roses and baby's breath. She pressed a button, and the large screens that had been set up around the venue to display wedding photos suddenly came to life with a video that had started this entire chain of events. For the first 30 seconds, the guests didn't understand what they were seeing. But as the footage continued and the audio became clear, a collective gasp rose from the assembled crowd that sounded like air being sucked out of the entire plantation. On those screens, in high definition and perfect sound quality, Michael Thompson was betraying not just his fiancée, but his entire family, his business, and everything he had ever claimed to believe in. Michael's reaction was exactly what Rebecca had expected and exactly what the FBI had hoped for. Instead of denying what everyone could clearly see and hear, he panicked and started shouting details that provided even more evidence than the video itself had contained. He screamed about how Sarah had seduced him, how she had manipulated him into sharing information, how he never meant for any of it to happen. Every word he spoke was being recorded by multiple federal agents, and his panic-fueled confession provided enough additional evidence to guarantee that the charges against him would stick in court. His father Richard turned white as a sheet as he realized that his son had just destroyed their family business in front of 300 witnesses, and his mother collapsed into her chair with her hands pressed to her mouth in horror. The video played for exactly 5 minutes, and when it ended, Rebecca took the microphone from the stunned officiant and began to speak in a voice that was steady, clear, and filled with a kind of quiet authority that made every person in that venue hang on her every word. She explained that she had discovered Michael's affair and his criminal activities 3 weeks earlier, that she had spent those weeks working with federal law enforcement to gather additional evidence, and that she had chosen to reveal the truth at their wedding because she wanted everyone who loved and supported them to know exactly who Michael Thompson really was before they celebrated a marriage built on lies and criminal conspiracy. She told the assembled guests that Michael was about to be arrested on federal charges, that Thompson Properties was under investigation by the FBI, and that she had chosen public humiliation over private confrontation because the scope of his betrayal deserved nothing less than complete exposure. When Rebecca finished speaking, she handed the microphone back to the officiant, removed her engagement ring, and placed it on the small table that held the marriage license they would never sign. She looked directly at Michael for the first time since the video had started playing and said in a voice that was barely above a whisper but somehow carried to every corner of the venue, "I loved you with everything I had, Michael. But I will not tie my life to a man who would betray his own family for money and betray me for someone who was using him to build a federal case. You deserve everything that's about to happen to you, and I deserve so much better than what you had planned to give me." The federal agents moved in before Michael could respond, and he was arrested on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering right there at the altar where he had expected to exchange vows with a woman he thought he knew. As he was being led away in handcuffs, several guests were crying, others were taking photos and videos with their phones, and still others were sitting in stunned silence trying to process what they had just witnessed. Rebecca stood at that altar in her beautiful dress and watched the man she had planned to spend her life with disappear into a federal transport vehicle, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she felt like she could finally breathe again. The reception that followed was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced before. Most of the guests stayed, partly out of shock and partly out of genuine concern for Rebecca, who had just put on the most impressive display of strength and courage that any of them had ever witnessed. Instead of a celebration of new love, it became a celebration of justice, truth, and one woman's refusal to be made a fool of by a man who had underestimated her intelligence and overestimated his own cleverness. Rebecca changed out of her wedding dress into a simple black dress she had brought for the occasion, and she spent the evening talking to guests who wanted to tell her how proud they were of her, how brave she had been, and how much they admired her for choosing truth over comfort. The media coverage of Rebecca's wedding began within hours and continued for weeks. The story of the bride who exposed her groom's federal crimes at their own wedding became national news, and Rebecca found herself fielding interview requests from major networks, newspapers, and magazines who wanted to hear her story in her own words. She agreed to a few interviews, partly to set the record straight and partly to encourage other women who might find themselves in similar situations to choose truth over denial, no matter how painful that truth might be. In every interview, Rebecca was careful to emphasize that her decision to handle the situation publicly wasn't about revenge or humiliation, but about justice and the importance of holding people accountable for their actions, especially when those actions hurt the people who love and trust them most. Michael Thompson was eventually sentenced to 12 years in federal prison on charges related to fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. Thompson Properties was shut down permanently, and Richard Thompson lost everything he had spent his entire life building because of his son's actions. Sarah Chen, whose real name was revealed to be Sarah Kim, continued working with federal law enforcement to prosecute other cases involving real estate fraud and money laundering. The FBI called Rebecca's cooperation in their investigation invaluable, and several agents told her that her willingness to go through with the wedding day confrontation had provided them with evidence they never would have been able to gather through traditional investigation methods. 6 months after what became known in Charleston as the wedding that broke the internet, Rebecca was featured on the cover of a major women's magazine with a headline "When Love Isn't Enough: How One Woman Chose Justice Over Fairy Tale." In the accompanying interview, Rebecca talked about how difficult it had been to maintain the facade for those 3 weeks between discovering the truth and revealing it publicly, but also about how empowering it had felt to take control of a situation where she had initially felt powerless and betrayed. She discussed the importance of trusting your instincts, doing your own research, and never being afraid to walk away from something that looks perfect on the surface but is rotten underneath. Rebecca never regretted her decision to handle Michael's betrayal in such a public way. She understood that some people thought she should have confronted him privately, cancelled the wedding, and moved on with her life without involving 300 innocent guests in what was essentially a very personal matter. But Rebecca knew that Michael's crimes went far beyond personal betrayal, that his actions had the potential to hurt countless innocent people, and that public accountability was sometimes the only way to ensure that justice was truly served. She also knew that if she had handled the situation privately, Michael would have found a way to manipulate the narrative, blame Sarah for seducing him, and paint himself as a victim of circumstances rather than a man who had made deliberate choices that hurt everyone who cared about him. 1 year after the wedding that never was, Rebecca was living in a beautiful townhouse in downtown Savannah, having relocated her marketing business and started fresh in a city where she wasn't known as the bride who exposed her groom at their wedding. She had started dating again, slowly and carefully, with a kind of wisdom that comes from having your trust betrayed so completely that you learn to trust your own instincts above everything else. She had also started speaking at conferences for women in business about the importance of due diligence not just in professional partnerships, but in personal relationships as well. Her message was simple but powerful. Love is not enough if it's built on lies, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from someone who would rather deceive you than respect you enough to tell you the truth. The video of Rebecca's wedding day confrontation continued to circulate on social media for months, and it sparked countless discussions about relationships, trust, betrayal, and the lengths people will go to for justice. Some viewers criticized Rebecca for handling such a private matter in such a public way, arguing that she could have achieved the same result without humiliating Michael in front of 300 people. But many more viewers praised her courage, her intelligence, and her refusal to be made a fool of by a man who had systematically lied to her about every aspect of his life. The video became a cultural touchstone for conversations about modern relationships and the importance of holding people accountable for their actions, no matter how much you love them. Think about this for a moment. How would you have handled discovering that the person you planned to spend your life with wasn't just cheating on you, but was also committing federal crimes that could destroy innocent people's lives? Would you have confronted them privately and given them a chance to explain? Would you have called off the wedding and walked away quietly? Or would you have done what Rebecca did and chosen to expose the truth in the most public way possible? There's no right answer to this question, because every situation is different and every person deserves to handle betrayal in whatever way feels right to them. But Rebecca's story raises important questions about the difference between private betrayal and public wrongdoing, and about our responsibility to speak up when we know that someone we love is hurting other people. What's particularly striking about Rebecca's story is how she transformed what could have been the worst day of her life into a moment of empowerment and justice. She could have chosen to be a victim, to retreat from public life, to spend years in therapy trying to understand how she could have been so wrong about someone she thought she knew completely. Instead, she chose to be an agent of justice, not just for herself but for all the innocent people who would have been hurt by Michael's continued criminal activity. She turned her wedding day into a courtroom, her wedding dress into armor, and her broken heart into a weapon for truth and accountability. Rebecca's story also highlights the importance of listening to that little voice in your head that tells you when something isn't quite right, even when everything else seems perfect. For months, Rebecca had small moments of doubt about Michael, tiny inconsistencies in his stories, minor changes in his behavior that she rationalized away because she was so in love with the idea of their future together. It wasn't until she received that video that all of those small moments clicked into place and formed a picture of a man who was very different from the one she thought she was marrying. Her story is a reminder that our instincts are usually right, even when our hearts want them to be wrong. The ripple effects of Rebecca's wedding day revelation continued to spread long after the immediate drama had subsided. Several other women came forward to report that they had also been approached by federal agents investigating men they were dating or married to, and Rebecca's story gave them the courage to cooperate with those investigations even when it meant potentially destroying relationships they valued. The FBI credited Rebecca's public exposure with encouraging other witnesses to come forward in similar cases, leading to additional prosecutions and convictions in real estate fraud cases across the Southeast. Perhaps most importantly, Rebecca's story became a beacon of hope for other women who found themselves in relationships with men who were not who they claimed to be. Her message was clear: you're stronger than you think you are, you deserve better than lies and deception, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from someone who would rather deceive you than respect you. Her story proved that it's possible to transform betrayal into empowerment, that public humiliation can sometimes be the most effective form of justice, and that choosing truth over comfort is always the right decision, even when it's the hardest decision you'll ever make. Today, Rebecca Martinez is thriving in ways she never imagined possible when she was planning a future with Michael Thompson. She has built a successful business, cultivated meaningful friendships, and learned to trust her own instincts in ways that make her stronger and wiser than she ever was before. She still believes in love, still wants to get married someday, and still thinks that the right person is out there waiting for her. But she also knows that she will never again ignore red flags or rationalize away behavior that doesn't align with someone's words. She knows her worth, she trusts her instincts, and she understands that sometimes the most beautiful thing you can do in a relationship is walk away from it when it's built on lies. Rebecca's wedding day will be remembered by everyone who was there as one of the most shocking and dramatic events they ever witnessed. But for Rebecca herself, it represents something much more significant: the day she chose truth over comfort, justice over denial, and her own worth over love that was built on deception. It was the day she learned that she was capable of strength she never knew she possessed, and that sometimes the most painful decisions are also the most necessary ones. It was the day Rebecca Martinez stopped being someone who could be lied to and started being someone who would always choose truth, no matter what the cost. So I ask you again, what would you have done in Rebecca's situation? How do you think you would have handled discovering that your entire relationship was built on lies and criminal activity? Do you think Rebecca was right to expose Michael so publicly, or do you think she should have handled it differently? And perhaps most importantly, what do you think this story teaches us about the importance of trusting our instincts, even when our hearts want us to ignore them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and remember to subscribe for more incredible true stories that will make you think, feel, and question everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and justice.